Hi, and welcome to the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force's Healthcare Provider Training. This is Module 3, Medico-Legal Options for Sexual Assault Patients. My name is Nicole Broder, and I'm a sexual assault nurse examiner and the SANE coordinator at the task force.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Aoi Mizushima. I am a SANE trained family physician.
So in this module, we'll be talking about different options for medical care that are available to sexual assault patients and going into the steps of the medical forensic exam, just an overview so that you know what the patient is going to be presented with as options. We'll also be talking about the patient's options with law enforcement in terms of reporting, not reporting, and what those options look like. Finally, we'll be talking about the role of the SAVE Fund in providing financial support to sexual assault patients. So the medical options for a sexual assault patient come down to three basic choices. First of all, they could opt for a very minimal wellness exam, which may include a medication consult. Typically, this happens when a patient really does not want to be seen medically after a sexual assault, but they have concerns about sexually transmitted infections and/or pregnancy. And so they may come into the emergency department, their physician's office, or another healthcare facility in order to discuss this concern and get prophylactic medications. It may also include just a general checkup. They have two options that go beyond just a wellness exam. The first is called a partial exam, which is available to a sexual assault patient at any time. It's reimbursed by the SAVE Fund, which we'll talk about in a little bit, up to 7 days after an assault. And it includes a physical exam so that a medical provider can check for injuries, other abnormalities, but does not include evidence collection. And this would also include the option for medications as well. So it includes that medication consult within this partial exam. This is typically chosen by patients who know that they do not want to work with law enforcement or are maybe being seen beyond any time frame in which they would expect evidence to be collected, for example, a week or two, even a month after an assault has occurred, where they still want some sort of medical documentation of the assault and they still want to see a medical provider and be checked out for any risks or infections, things like that. But again, they know that they do not want evidence collected for some reason. The final option is the most comprehensive option, and we call this a complete exam or a full exam. And again, it includes everything above, so there will be the option for medications, there will be the physical assessment, but it also includes evidence collection, and that's the key piece that marks it as a complete exam. That is available up to 120 hours or 5 days after an assault. That's the time period in which we have some expectation that we might be able to collect evidence. So any of these options are available to a patient who comes in after a sexual assault. A really important thing in terms of the medical care for the patient is that the patient has complete control over their exam. Typically, an aspect of sexual assault is that this patient's bodily autonomy has been taken away from them. And so one of the things that we really want to do as healthcare providers is help give that back. So that means that we are asking for their consent every step of the way. It means that we're putting aside our own biases, prejudices, or wishes in terms of what we'd like them to do or not do. Sometimes that can be tough. I've seen many patients where they've gone through an assault that was particularly horrific, and in my heart I just really wanted them to go to the police and seek criminal justice, and that was not the right place for them to be at. And it was really important for me to step back in that moment and recognize that to really support the patient's holistic well-being, I needed to respect where they were at the time, and put my own wishes aside, even if that felt frustrating to me. The part of this also is that the patient can revoke consent for the exam at large or any individual piece at any time. This is something that SANEs will discuss with patients at the beginning, that they can have any part of the exam done, that certain parts of the exam will help other parts to be done more comprehensively, but that doesn't mean that the patient has to do one thing in order to have other options available to them. And they can change their mind in the middle too. So if a patient is starting to feel overwhelmed or like maybe they didn't fully understand what a genital exam, for example, was going to entail, and in the middle they need to slow down or change the options or stop altogether. That's something that we are going to support them in. So in brief, I'm just going to go through the steps of the exam. This is not something that you need to know in any particular depth, except that it is helpful so that you have an idea of what the patient will be offered as choices. And if the patient is asking you what the exam may look like, you have some sort of idea of what to tell them. First of all, when the SANE arrives, they'll always start by introducing themselves to the patient. Many patients don't know what a sexual assault nurse is. And they'll explain the steps of the exam in somewhat of a similar way to how I'm doing right now, and the SAVE Fund as well. If the patient elects to move forward with any part of the exam, then the SANE will get written consents, which could be for the exam itself, for evidence collection, and or for photography. So then going to the exam itself, I consider the exam to have 4 steps, although you could technically break it down in different ways. I think of the 4-step process as an easy way to remember. The first step is the history. So that's a history of the assault itself and any other relevant medical history as well. There's a lot of questions that go in here. It can be very personal. Building rapport is a very important part of what the SANE is going to be doing with the patient during all of these steps. But based on the history, the details that the SANE is able to get from the patient, we can then move on to a head-to-toe physical exam. So looking at the patient's body surfaces for anything abnormal, which could be bruises, cuts, other wounds, tenderness, could be signs of evidence, debris, secretions, things like that. And so that could include evidence collection along the way, which would be in the form of little cotton swabs that are rubbed on the patient's skin. The third step is the anogenital exam. We're trying to move from least invasive to most invasive to again allow the patient some time to build up rapport with the SANE, comfort level. And so the anogenital exam, if their genitals were involved in the assault, this could also include evidence collection, again in the form of cotton swabs. And those cotton swabs would be collected from any place on the patient's body where the assailant's DNA may be found and where the patient's consenting, of course. And then the final step is that based on the history and the findings of the physical exam, the SANE is in the best position to then talk about medications and referrals with the patient. So typically this is going to include prophylaxis against sexually transmitted infections and HIV. It will include medications to prevent pregnancy if the patient has a uterus. It could also include referrals for things like mental health, for assistance with housing, jobs, school, anything else that may be involved in keeping the patient safe from a holistic standpoint. So then when it comes to the patient's options with law enforcement, there are 4 basic options. The first option is to not report. Sexual assault is not reportable in and of itself as a medical provider. And so if the patient does not want to report to the police, they absolutely do not have to. So this would mean that they're probably going to do a wellness exam or a partial exam, something without evidence being collected. There's also the option for what's called an anonymous kit or a non-reporting kit. And what this means is that patients can have evidence collected just as if they were going to report to police. But then the evidence is sealed inside a kit that remains anonymous and is identified only with a 6-digit code. And actually may be a different number of digits at some point in the future, but it's just a numerical identifier for the kit. The patient is then sent home with that identifier. The kit is stored by law enforcement without any sort of identifying information for the patient put on the front. And then if the patient decides to report later on, they can go to law enforcement with that number and elect to report and have that kit processed at that time. A couple of important notes there. One is that Melissa's Law, which was passed in 2017 or 2018, notes that kits need to be stored for 60 years, that's 60 years by law enforcement. And that's in the state of Oregon, that's not nationwide. That gives patients a very long time to decide to report. Now, it may be out of the statute of limitations by the time that they report, but it would still be processed and the patient would still be given that information. The other thing to know about an anonymous kit is that it will not be sent to the crime lab or tested unless the patient does report. So that's important for a few different reasons in terms of how DNA gets into the system and what kind of follow-up law enforcement can do. But that's an important thing for patients to know. So the kit will not be tested unless they make a report. But this kit just allows them to put a pause button on everything, to have evidence collected while it may still be on their body, but to choose a later point at which to work with law enforcement or to choose not to work with them at all. The third option is reporting. So the patient can report the crime to law enforcement, and that will start an investigation there. And then the last thing is that it may be a mandatory report. So as medical professionals, we have mandatory reporting obligations, as we all know. The most common ones that will overlap with a sexual assault fall into three categories. One is age-related. So anyone under the age of 18 or 65 and older are considered to be a mandatory report. One would be child abuse, the other would be elder abuse. The second is a developmentally disabled or mentally ill person who is disabled or ill to the point of vulnerability. That is reportable as a vulnerable adult. Now that can be hard, that's a big gray area. We know that developmental disabilities and mental illnesses really run the gamut. And so this whole point of vulnerability is really the key point that we want to hold to is, does this disability or does this illness make this person more vulnerable to being assaulted, which of course is the point of mandatory reports. We're trying to protect vulnerable populations. If the answer to that question is yes, then that would be a mandatory report. And finally, this is a little bit of a special category, but non-accidental serious injuries also have to be reported. However, it does not have to be reported that they were sustained in the course of a sexual assault. Only the injury in that case is reportable, unlike the previous categories in which the sexual assault itself is reportable. So typically, we're going to be reporting to law enforcement and DHS, although sometimes we can also ask them to cross-report. And then finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the SAVE Fund. That stands for the Sexual Assault Victims Emergency Fund. It is made available to anyone who is assaulted in Oregon within 7 days who seeks medical care within 7 days. And it covers the medical expenses for one visit. It's not affected by reporting status or insurance coverage. So the patient could be reporting to law enforcement, not reporting, get an anonymous kit collected, doesn't matter, still covered by the SAVE Fund. They could have the best insurance in the world or no insurance, again, still covered by the SAVE Fund. And so the same nurse will fill out the application form for the SAVE Fund with the patient. But what's important for you to know is that it really does help alleviate financial costs for the patient. All sexual assault related costs at the time of the initial visit within that 7-day window are going to be covered, in addition to 5 free counseling sessions made available after the visit. And it also covers the cost of evidence collection when that's done within 5 days as well. So again, the SANE will take care of all those details in terms of getting the patient connected. But again, that's helpful for you to know. While the SAVE Fund is not available to anyone assaulted outside of Oregon, every state has their own version of the SAVE Fund. And so it may not cover everything quite exactly the way that ours does, but the patient can get in contact with that state's funding source wherever they were assaulted and seek out financial assistance there. Things that aren't covered, non-sexual assault related care. So if the patient, maybe they've been having issues with controlling their diabetes, but they haven't seen a doctor and they decide, well, since I'm here, I might as well have someone take a look at this. That's not going to be covered. Only costs related to the sexual assault itself are going to be covered. In addition, any costs outside of the hospital or the visit, so that would include prescriptions, follow-up, things like that, is not going to be covered. And then HIV prophylaxis is covered at 50%, although that's a little bit more relevant to how the hospital is reimbursed by the SAVE Fund rather than anything that is going to directly affect the patient. So the process is that there is a 3-page application form that the SANE will fill out with the patient. They'll send that to the billing department at the facility. Billing will send it to the Crime Victim Services Division, and then they will send reimbursement to the hospital from there. And the hospital should not be sending a bill then to the patient for anything that was covered by the fund. So I am just including the links to the Save Fund website and the application in case that's of use. Again, the SANE will handle it, but it's always good to know about the resources out there to support your patients.
And can I add one quick thing, Nicole?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for all of that information. So, as a medical provider listening to this, it might feel like very overwhelming. There's so much that goes into this SANE exam and all the kind of nitty-gritty steps of like what's covered, what's not covered, and but just really kind of emphasizing every practice is different, every setting is different, and who you're caring for when the patient walks in, when the survivor walks in. When we, as the medical team at my clinic, when a survivor comes in, the grand majority of the time, the basic questions that every survivor, I think, will always have are just the basic questions of, am I okay? Was I hurt? Am I going to catch anything? Will I get pregnant? So those are kind of like the places that we always start with the survivor, of kind of just kind of taking that in. And I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes people's reflex button when they hear that a survivor is coming in, or sometimes they don't realize that that's the next person that they're going to see on their schedule. Some providers might hit a little bit of a oh no, send them to the ER right now. I can't, I'm not prepared for this. I can't, I know that there's a big, lengthy, complicated process that's involved with caring for this survivor. And I would just really, really encourage each one of you to sort of know that you have the skill set to care for this person, and also to know, like Nicole reviewed, all of the kind of the time frame that you're working with. Sometimes it's not an emergency that you call somebody to do a kit right away, and that's sometimes not even what the survivor has come for. They've come to kind of just address those questions that I just mentioned with you, and so just really kind of, I'm so glad that Nicole kind of went through all the steps just now, because just know that the SANE will kind of go over all of these and do a head-to-toe exam if that's what the survivor decides they would like to do. But sometimes it might just be kind of assessing for pregnancy and STI prophylaxis, and if that is truly all that the survivor is asking for, sometimes you can work with them on that and give them all of we have handouts that we give all survivors that kind of walk through all of their options and resources, and sometimes we have the survivor come back the next day. Sometimes it's just a lot for somebody to come in and disclose for the first time, and so there's time. It's not after you've assessed that they are medically stable, there's often time to just take a breath and just know that you have resources. If there are SANEs in the town where you're practicing, that you can have the survivor come back if they're willing to, or if it's at the end of the day and you know that the SANE exam may take a few hours, but just rest assured that as you just saw through all the slides, there's a very detailed process of kind of what happens and what the SANE is kind of going through very systematically with that survivor, and offering and pausing and checking in to make sure that they are being given their options and as much of their agency. They're trying to kind of work with them to give them as much agency as possible in making decisions all along the way. So that's the only extra piece that I would add in there.
Thank you, Allie.
Of course.